In this groovy episode of Making Stuff with Things, we're going to build the chainsaw arm from Evil Dead. This is a thick video, there's a lot to go over. This thing's made out of a lot of different materials. We're talking EVA foam, we're talking 3D printed parts, we're talking styrene plastic. Now if you actually want to build your own and follow along, the STL files and the patterns for the foam will be available on our Gumroad. Alright, let's not waste any more time and let's get to the build. Alright, so let's start off with the patterns, more specifically the pattern for the main body. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to go into some kind of print preview, okay? I'm using Photoshop for this. So what you want to do is just drag it down. See that dotted line? You want to drag it down just so it's just above the bottom of the page. And then what you want to do is just hit print. Now once that prints out, we'll just go back into print preview and we'll move it up to the top just like this. Make sure to leave a little gap there. Alright, print it out. So what we're going to do is on one sheet, we're going to cut right down that line. And then we're going to line it up on the other sheet. And we're going to take some tape and we're just going to tape it down. Alright, so now we're going to give these templates some rigidity and longevity. Longevity. Make them last longer. So we're going to put them onto some poster board. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spray down the poster board and the paper with some Super 77 spray adhesive. Alright, I let that sit for a little bit, let it get nice and tacky. General rule of thumb is if you put your finger down on it and it's a little tacky but it doesn't stick to your finger, it is good to go. Alright, so we're just going to slap those patterns onto that poster board. Now I'm just going to cut it out. Alright, now let's move on to the rest of the patterns. They're pretty straightforward. Cut them out. That's it. You just cut them out. Now you'll see on the patterns we got these little black lines on the outlines. Those are registration marks. Now what you want to do is actually cut them out. I'd like to make little triangles with the X-Acto blade and they just pop right out. You want to make sure that you transfer all of the registration marks. Now this will ensure that the foam takes the shape that we actually want it to take. So these registration marks are important. Alright, so now that we got them cut out, let's get to the foam stuff. The main body will be made out of floor mat foam and the rest will be cut out of 6mm foam. So I'm just going to go through and trace all of the patterns. I like to use little pins to hold them down, or sometimes even 1, 2, 3 blocks or machinist blocks. So once they're traced, I like to transfer all the information that is given on the template, such as the angle that it needs to be cut at, the name of the part, and where it connects to other parts. So now that we have those all traced out, it's time to cut out the foam. Now hold on there. Before you get to cutting, you got to know some things here. You're going to find 3 different lines on these patterns. You're going to find a solid line, which means it needs to be cut at a straight up and down 90-degree angle. You're going to find this dashed line here. Look at that. That means 45-degree angle. And then lastly, you'll find one dotted line, and that means it's going to be cut at an extremely sharp angle. All right, let's get to cutting that foam. Now you're going to want to change your blade pretty often because the foam is notorious for dulling blades really quickly. The sharper the blade, the easier the cutting out will be. it's time to move on to the main body, which is the part that all the other parts are going to attach to. Now when I cut this out, I purposefully didn't cut at 45-degree angles like you're supposed to. Well, honestly, I just wanted to use my new disc sander. So I set it to 45 degrees and I got the sanding. Let's just say it's a lot quicker and easier to actually cut them at 45-degree angles than to go back with any kind of sanding device. Yeah, this took a long time, a lot more time than it was actually worth. Alright, with that out of the way, now you might notice that the templates for the main body are lacking in these important registration marks. So what I'm going to do is start off by picking two random spots, one for the start and one for the end. Now I recommend picking the top and the bottom, as there's going to be another piece of foam covering both those parts. So it's good to have a seam right there. Alright, so I marked the top as the start and the bottom as the end. So what I'm going to do now is cut out a rectangle off a piece of... Let's try that again, but with words. So what I'm going to do is cut out a rectangular strip from the poster board. Now we need to make this thing 4 inches wide. Alright, once that strip is cut out, we're going to make some little tabs, and these tabs are going to be used to hold together the main body template part and the strip of poster board. When I did the original chainsaw, this is how I originally constructed it, how I came up with the shapes and everything. Just through a bunch of tabs and taping things together. So you want to start the strip at the start and just tape it around and just use these tabs to hold that shape, and when you get to the end, just mark it off. So what I'm going to do, while these two pieces are still attached, I'm going to create the registration marks now. Again, this is how I did it originally. Once those registration marks are all set up, I'm going to take it off the main body template piece, and I'm going to cut it off at the end here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it in half. Make sure it is completely in half, like not shifted in any way. And I'm going to cut out the registration marks. This way I cut out both sides at the same time. Now I'm just going to do the same for the front piece. Now all that's left to do is to transfer that over onto our foam and cut it out. And after that's done, I'm just going to glue it together. Now that we've got it glued together, we're going to add 2mm foam to the top and bottom. The top is going to look like this, and the bottom is going to look like this. And you know what? I'm feeling extra lazy, so I'm not even going to cut it out properly. I'm going to make it extra wide. I'm going to cut it to length, but I'm going to cut it extra wide so that I can just cut it off after it's glued on to see if that's easier. So first thing I'm going to do is start out with the top, and I'm going to mark that where it should end down the front. Yep, there it is. So you just pop some glue on there, and you just pop on the top. Alright, for the bottom, I decided to try it with super glue this time, because you can use super glue on foam.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
Yeah, for a number of reasons, it's probably best to just stick with the contact cement. Also, we're going to be doing some shaping with our Dremel, and the super glue does not work very well with the Dremel. Alright, so once that's down, I'm going to cut it all down to size, and I'm going to use the Dremel to fix up the edges and kind of unsharpen those edges. right, and with that, we're done with the main body. So first thing I'm going to do is fire up the old disc sander, and I'm going to get to work on cleaning up the angles for just basically all the 6mm foam stuff. Alright, so I'm actually going to glue up all of the 6mm pieces and attach them together. So that's going to be the left side, the blade cover, and the exhaust. Just going to get that out of the way. I know I didn't really talk about it on the main body section, but for the glue, I'm using contact cement. It's Barge. I actually put it into this little squeezy bottle that I got. First time using it like that. So much easier, so much cleaner, so much less stinky. All right, so you basically want to put a nice thin layer down. I like to spread it around with a brush or another piece of scrap foam, and you let that sit for about 5 minutes to let it get tacky. Now the same rule applies as with the spray adhesive, the Super 77. If it's tacky, but it doesn't stick to your finger, then it's good to go. If it sticks to your finger, give it a little more time. If it isn't tacky, oops, you waited too long, gotta do it again. Alright, once those are glued up, I'm gonna use my Dremel and I'm gonna clean up any edges and also round them off a little bit. Alright, so the first thing we're going to build for the left side is the side handle. Now I use this piece of insulation and I'm going to put some wire in it to give it some rigidity. So last time I used aluminum armature wire, which is it's bendable, it's pliable, but it's a little too bendyable. So I'm going to use this other wire. I don't know what it is. I know it's harder to cut through and it's less soft, so I'm going to use that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the chainsaw that I started last year. Hey look, a pupper. Alright, back to the task at hand. I measured 15 inches. I think it's a little bit too long, so I'm going to try and shoot for 14 this time. Alright, so I just measure out the wire and cut it out. Now, I went for, I think, 33 inches on the wire, because we're actually going to double it up and braid it. So you want double the length, or a little bit more than double the length. And you actually want to make it a little bit longer than it's supposed to be. We can always cut it down later. Ow, that's hot. Hey, this actually gets pretty hot when you do this. Alright, I measured that out once that's done, and looks like we're about where we want it. Alright, so now I'm going to actually measure out the 14 inches for the insulation, and I'm just going to mark that off. Once it's marked, I cut it. Well, duh, that's what do you think we're going to do? Alright, so I'm going to stick the wire in there. Make sure that the looped part is flush with one end, and you have the non-looped part sticking out. So what I'm going to do is take some plumber's putty, and I'm going to putty up that hole to make sure that that wire stays in place. What you do with this stuff, you just cut off a little bit, take off the little plastic wrapper, and you just squish it a bunch until it becomes one solid color. Alright, so I think this knurling stuff on the handle is just a little too much for my little sensitive fingies. So I'm going to take a heat gun and I'm going to lightly go across it and kind of shrink those in on themselves. Not all the way though. I do want to keep that texture. Just make it a little less stabby. Alright, once that's done, we're going to make the little end cap, and that goes at the beginning. Wait, no, hold on. The end. I just cut off a little scrap piece of foam. Not too big. You don't need it too big. It's not going to be that big. Don't worry about it. And I just trace around the insulation piece to get my size. Now I'm not going to cut this into a circle because cutting circles into foam is not a fun experience. This is a case where the disc sander comes perfectly equipped for this. So I set it to 90 degrees and got to shaping it. Now once you got it down to the inside of the markings that you made, we're going to round it off with the Dremel. Hey, it's going to look like this. Now we're going to cut out the little wrapping part that goes around the base of it. Just make a 2-inch rectangle. I didn't cut it down to length because I'm just going to cut it once I figure out how it's going to fit on. Alright, so I'm going to bevel both sides of one edge. And this is going to be the outside edge. Once that's good, I'm going to test fit it, and I'm even going to mark it off with a Sharpie where it ends so I know where to put the glue. Once I get to the seam, I'm going to cut it down the size, then throw some glue into that hole, let it dry a little bit, and then stick it together. Alright, so now it's time to take care of that little nubby sticking out. And look at all those sparks. Once I took care of that, and all the fires that I started, I'm gonna put it down onto the foam where I want it to be. It's gonna be right towards the front, and you wanna make sure that there's about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch kind of overhanging underneath the bottom of the left side. Once I marked the hole that I'm gonna cut out, I cut it out. Now I did a sloppy cut and then just went in with the Dremel and fixed it up. Now you might notice that there's a little gap between the front and the handle. Well, that's okay. We're just gonna build that. I just roughly cut it out and shaped it with the Dremel. Alright, once you got that down to size and all the things you need, glue it in place. Alright, so the next thing we're gonna work on is the intake. Now, according to Cura, this is gonna take about two days to print. Oh my god. Yeah, I don't have time for that. So what I'm gonna do is just simply take it off the last year's chainsaw. Anyway, moving on. So we're gonna clean up this piece, not just the blood. Once you let that dry, you can just sand it down into a nice smooth finish. So for this next part, we gotta cut out a hole for the intake and the foam. So I'm over in Blender to explain this. We have our intake and we have our foam. If we go to a completely side angle here, and we bring this down so it's flush with the foam, you'll notice that there's only a certain amount that's actually contacting the foam. We can actually just trace what is contacting the foam and then cut that out in a little half circle. And you know, we can always fix it up with the Dremel too. So you'll have part of a hole cut out. Now what happens if you bring our little friend back down, because of that hole, it'll sit down a little further into the foam. What we can do now is mark off that new area that's being contacted with the foam and cut that out. And little by little, we can just bring it down and keep marking that off until we have our full hole cut out. Now we also have part of this bit sticking out that gets contacted with the foam, so we're actually going to need to cut a little bit of that out too. So we're just going to kind of do the same technique. Alright, so once I have the shape of the hole cut, I'm going to put it in there, and I'm going to mark off on the intake where the foam contacts it, so I know where to put the glue again. Now there is kind of like a gap underneath. You can't really see it, but I'm going to seal it up with some hot glue. And with that, that's probably the chunkiest part of the video, the most complex part. Let's move on to the next part. And now it's time to make the blade. First things first, let's make the template for the blade. I measure out a 22-inch long line, just randomly. And I take my little compass and I draw out a circle 4 inches in diameter. And the center point for that is going to be on that line. From there, I take my ruler and I measure out 2 inches from either side of that center line. Now hold on, chainsaw blades are not super straight. They got a little bit of a bend to them. To create this, I set up a bunch of 1, 2, 3 blocks and use my ruler and bend it in a certain shape, and then I trace that out. It's gonna look something like this. Here's one I prepared earlier. Now the blade itself is going to be made out of styrene plastic. My sheets of styrene are not long enough for the chainsaw blade, so what I'm going to have to do is weld 2 sheets together end to end. But before we do that, we need to trace it onto the styrene. Once I trace it out, I actually create a registration mark so I know exactly how it's supposed to go together. Now, styrene is actually pretty simple to cut out. You just score it a bunch of times, The thicker it is, the more you're gonna have to score it. You score it a couple times, and all you do, just snap it one way, and then snap it the other way, and it snaps right off. Now for the round bits on the edge of the chainsaw blade, I like to cut little lines going out from that curve, so that I'm not cutting out one entire curve at one go. Breaking it down into smaller pieces, easy to work with, but it does require a little bit more cleanup, as there's usually a few nubbies. Now we're going to weld these two pieces together, but first I want to take some sandpaper and create kind of like a ditch. So we're actually going to be using this tiny stick of styrene here. You don't really want to make the trenches larger than that. So for the adhesive, I'm using Weld On 3. So what I do is I pour it into the bottom of the Coke can that I cut out. I got that one from Adam Savage's Tested. This way you're working with a smaller amount, and this stuff actually evaporates really quickly. So what we're going to do is prep the surface with a brush. We're going to dip it into the weld on and just slide it across that seam. And we just lay down our little stick buddy. I like to take an X-Acto blade and kind of smoosh it out. What it's actually doing is melting the plastic together to create a literal weld of plastic. How long it's going to take to actually dry is going to depend on a lot of different factors. I'd give it a few hours, as we're going to be cleaning it up and sanding it a lot, so we want it to be completely solid. So once we're good to go, we're going to snip it off with some flush cutters. So I take the sanding block that I made out of old plywood and 150 grit sandpaper, and I get to work on that seam, just sanding it down flat to the surface. From there, you might have some voids or, spaces where the plastic didn't quite make it. We want to clean them up with some acrylic green spot putty. While I'm waiting for it to completely dry, those little nubbies I was talking about, I'm going to file them down. Once our spot putty is dry, I use 220 grit sandpaper and sand that down to the plastic. Now this should fill all the voids. Now if it doesn't, you can always do another layer. Once that's done, I take a 320 sanding sponge and I just go over the whole surface and make it all roughed up with the paint and stuff. Now it's time to make the gooey center of the blade sandwich. For that I use 2mm foam. Now again, we're going to be needing 2 pieces of foam end to end, so I'm going to create those registration marks. Now once that's traced, I'm actually going to inset all of the edges except for the back end where it's going to attach to the chainsaw. Now I just eyeballed it, but it was probably about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch, maybe, of a gap. So yeah, I just go around the whole edge, mark that out. Then I cut it out, and this time I'm just going to use some CA glue. Once that's glued down and dried, more CA glue, and then we put on the top. Now that the 2 pieces are together, we're going to actually sand the edges down flat so they're even with each other. One technique for making sure that you don't have any high spots is cover it in a Sharpie marker and then you sand it down. If you have a high spot, that high spot's going to get sanded down and you're going to lose the marking while it's going to stay on the other side. So now you just want to keep on going until they're even. And then I move back on to my 320 sanding sponge. I love this thing. So now we got to drill out the holes for the bolts that are going to hold it to the body of the chainsaw. So I'm going to work my way up from a smaller bit to the largest bit just to keep from cracking this plastic. Unfortunately, the largest bit wasn't really on the same page as me with that one. And that's the blade. Hey everybody, so I'm feeling a little sick right now, and I'm not really feeling like recording a whole audio bit for this next section, so the show must go on, so I'm going to leave it up to my good friend, Mr. Smalls. Take it away.
First, we are going to start with the arm band. Cut out a rectangle 3.5 inches tall. The length will depend on the diameter of your arm. There's a metal wrapping that we are going to cut out a 2mm foam, making it about 1/2 inch shorter than the armband. Now I'm going to mark the cutouts 1/4 of an inch across the whole thing. Cut out every other 1/4 inch until you reach the end. Next, glue the arm end together and round off one end. Now, use your glue to attach the wrapping. Take the strip of scrap, 6mm foam and shape it in a kind of old fashion. Take a look at this. Now cut it into 2 half-inch sections. Glue them on either side of the armband like this. Take some 2mm foam and cut out some small nuts. Ha 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 ha. Look at how small your nuts are. Make 4 of them and glue them onto each end of the fasteners. Cut out a small rectangle of 6mm foam for the pole handle. You can make it whatever size you like, as long as it fits nicely in your hands. Pre-shape the foam by heating it up and rolling it into shape. Now just hold it there while it cools. Look at this fool, can't even find a seat. Glue it together, mark the left and right side. Then trace the ends on some more 6mm foam. Be sure to label them appropriately. How you made a face, laugh out loud. Once you glued them up, clean up the seam and make it flush with the barrel of the handle, then round off the edges a little. This fool has not mentioned it yet, but put your rotary tool on a low setting while shaping foam, you get more control. Take the tinny blade and score the surface a whole bunch. Keep it random and don't be afraid to slice off some chunks. We're making old wood texture. Don't cut your hand like a dummy. Keep your digits out of the way of that blade. Heat it up with the heat gun and watch the slice magically open up like a flower and bloom. Careful as the seams can start to separate. Even if you let the glue dry completely, just stick it back down and hope it holds honestly. Honestly, it takes some practice. It can be difficult to achieve this wood look. Practice on scrap foam until you feel comfortable enough to do it for real. Drill some holes into the top and bottom so we can fit this rope through. Clean up the holes with the rotary tool in a small bit. Now for the top handle, cut out 2 strips of .08 styrene that are 20mm wide and 7.5 inches long. For them to give a like we did with the blade. Now let's make the smaller bit that sticks out. That is made from .06 plastic. It is 3.5 inches long and 16.5mm wide. Now we are gonna make some brush metal texture in the plastic. Take some coarse sandpaper, like 180 grit. Press down hard and go in one direction down the length of the pieces. Do a few passes until you have something that feels right. Glue on the .06 plastic so that it is sticking out 2.5 inches. We are going to add some real matching screws to this part eventually. So let's drill those holes. Put them where the smaller part overlaps the main handle part. I also drill a hole at one in the handle while painting. Time to bend the plastic. Make sure it is heated up nice and good. Take some kind of flat surface object and hold it at the point you wish to bend it. I use a sanding stick. Oh, shit! Didn't I say make sure it is heated up nice and good? I'm pretty sure I did. Look dummy, now you broke it. Now you gotta fix it. I made the wooden parts of the handle from 20mm foam square down holes. Cut them both to the same length and sanded them flat on the descender. Then sanded them down at an angle. I tried to feel working the steeper angles. I settled on 35 degrees. Round off the edges with some sanding sticks. Now slice the heck out of that thing like with the pull handle. Try varying the blade length to get more randomness. Now for the biggest pain in my backside, the gas and oil caps. I used the caps from vitamin water bottles. They had a brand name across the top, so we gotta fill them in. I use spot putty. Look how it shrinks into the letters. Maybe another layer will work. I hate to break it to you, it didn't. I tried to mix up some baby glue with super powder. Wait, hold on, baby powder and super glue. Wait for that to sand and then sand the heck out of it. Or just buy a beverage that doesn't have their damn logo on it. Problem solved. Let's move on to the exhaust piece. Print it out and clean up the layer lines and anything else that needs done doing. Use some sandable filler primer to help you out. Now's a good time to print out and clean up the mesh prints included in the files. Lastly, we need to make the little metal strips that are used to hold the armband to the main body. I cut out 3 strips from .06 plastic. They are each 2.5 inches long and 3/4 of an inch wide. I clean them up and add the brush metal texture. Hit them up and from the length of the shape you want.
Hey, thanks Biggie for taking the time out of your schedule to come out and do this thing.
No problem, my friend. The pleasure was all mine.
For the first assembly, let's start marking off where things are gonna go. Those holes we drilled into the blade, now we gotta transfer them over to the foam. So make sure you have where your blade's gonna be placed and trace it through and drill those holes. Next, I'm gonna mark out where the inside of the armband is gonna go, and then I'm gonna cut it out. Once I make a rough cut, of course I'm gonna clean it up with the Dremel. It's a good idea to make sure that your hand's gonna fit through the hole at this point. Yeah, should have seen that coming. Now I'm just gonna attach the armband using contact cement. It is at this point, it starts to become an actual thing. Because you can put your hand in it, you got that armband. Oh, I love this step, when everything starts coming together. Alright, so let's attach the blade cover and the exhaust base. So now we're actually going to want to put that mesh inside the exhaust piece. I just cut out an appropriate size circle, and if it doesn't fit, which it didn't, I just kind of go around and clip off a little bit at a time until it fits. Then we're just going to use some CA glue and glue it in place. Once that's good to go, attach it to the exhaust base. Now make sure it's in the right orientation. It wants to be an X if you're looking at it straight on, not a plus. Alright, so let's mark off where the entire left side is going to go. Before you glue it on, make sure you put in that mesh. Otherwise it's going to be too late. Now we're just glue it into place with contact cement. Now before we get to painting, we actually want to heat seal the entire thing. So we're just going to take a heat gun and go over it and heat it up nice and good. Now, careful of the seams because the glue can start to separate, as with the wooden handle that we tried to make. If it comes apart, just stick it back together. Also, keep in mind that you have 3D printed parts. Mine are made out of PLA, so they have a low melting temperature. Keep that in mind. So yeah, try not to hold it over the printed parts too long. Next, I'm just going to rough cut out a little rectangle here, and that's going to go inside the armband so we can actually hang it up while we go to paint it. I just used some hot glue to hold it in place. And now is a perfect time to grab a snack from the freezer. Ah, this should do. Now you can attach a little clippy to it. Whee! Okay, full disclosure, my silicone went bad and I didn't have enough time to order more, so I'm gonna have to use this video from when I created the original chainsaw 4 years ago. Oops! So first thing I'm gonna do is wrap it in plastilina modeling clay. You can use any kind of brand, just make sure it doesn't have sulfur in it, otherwise it will inhibit the curing of the silicone. Once I have that all set up, I'm gonna create a mold box out of foam board. I like to use a hot glue gun. That usually works out the best, but make sure you seal it up nice and good because this silicone will find any way to escape. As far as the silicone goes, I use Smooth On Mold Star 20T. So when I pour it, I'm going to actually put it on the ground and pour it from a high level up, pouring a little bit at a time. This will pop any air bubbles on the way down. Now I'm going to let that cure completely. For the 20T, it takes a few hours. Once the silicone is set, you can pop those things right out of there. You might need to clean out the clay. I also like to take an X-Acto blade and kind of clean up the edges, any flashing. Now for the plastic, I'm using Smooth On Smooth Cast 300. This is pretty simple. You just mix 1 to 1 and pour it into your mold. Boom, you have your bolts. Now before I do assembly, I actually want to clear coat everything, but before I do that, I actually want to put the teeth onto the blade. I pretty much just dripped some glue down into the groove and glued them into place. As I went along, I made sure to alternate all the teeth so that like parts were touching like parts. Now, it wasn't until I got to the end of the top when I realized something. After a quick count, I realized that I didn't have enough teeth, so now I have to print out more. Yeah, it didn't go well. An hour and 40-minute long print, and somewhere between an hour and 30 and an hour 40, one of them popped off and caused chaos on the whole print. Thank you. Yep, this build is definitely cursed. So I print them out again, do all the painting, and then finish the assembly. There's pretty much 3 different colors of teeth, so I went through, put a piece of paper down at the base of the teeth, and sprayed down one very light coat of the dark metal, just to make them a little more even. Let's start cutting down the bolts. Now, there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can do this a very delicate way, which is with an X-Acto saw. The use of this specific tool is to get very delicate, accurate cuts. Or you can go with the more chaotic, cut it with a Dremel. Which one do you think I chose? Now when cutting them down, I made sure not to go all the way to the edge of the actual bolt. I made sure to leave a little stump. I'm going to take care of this with the disc sander. Alright, so from there I'm ready to clear coat everything. Alright, so now that everything is clear coated, we're going to start the assembly. I'm going to start with the top handle. More specifically, I'm going to start with the wood pieces and gluing them to the handle. So I took some 220 sandpaper and just sanded back the paint so that the glue can have something that's not paint to grab onto. Alright, now I'm just going to tickle its feet with some sandpaper and get ready to put it on the chainsaw. Now I make sure to get the handle exactly where I want to put it. It's probably a best idea if you actually stand up for this and look at it from above. That way you can see if you're in the center, if you're straight, and all that stuff. So once I get it where I want it, I actually mark it off. I took a file and I just used the edge of it to kind of scratch into the paint. This way it would also give the glue a little something more to grab onto. And I just glue it on, 1 foot at a time. And then I just glue one of our cast bolts onto each foot. Now I'm going to take the little screw heads that I cast and I'm going to put them on the top handle, 1 on each side. Make sure to inset it from each end as well. Now the actual prop does have electrical tape on the handle towards the back, so I make sure to put that on there too. Now it's time to glue on strips. Now I was a little worried because I had marked each one where they go, but those were immediately covered with paint. Because they were preformed to the chainsaw, they actually only went together in one specific way. So it was like a puzzle piece. Anyway, I just glue that on and glue a bolt onto each end, and then I repeat that for the other 2. I also make sure to glue on the 2 bolts on the front, 1 on each side, and making sure it's on that 2mm foam. Next up are the gas and oil caps. I put the red one in the front, black one in the back. Alright, so let's move on to the rope pull handle. Now I'm just using 6mm jute rope, and to cut this, I just put some electrical tape where I want to cut it, and I cut it with a mat knife. Then I drip some CA glue on the end there, hit it with some kicker, and then remove the tape. Now I just jam it into the hole. I don't actually glue it in yet, because I'm actually going to have to remove this thing. Then we just simply slide the foam pull handle onto the rope to where we want. I said simply. Simply, please. Then we painstakingly get the rope through the hole that we drilled in the pull handle eventually, and we pull that to about the height that we want, and then we tie a knot. Once I have the knot where I want it, I'm going to pull it tight, and I'm going to drip some CA glue onto the end of it so that it will hold its place, and then I cut off the excess. After that, I just glue the end into the chainsaw. Now after that's done, I just looked around a little bit, made sure I wasn't missing anything, and I realized something looked a little funny. This tape is supposed to go in the back. I put it in the front. For some reason I didn't catch that, but you know what? Nah, whatever. I just pull it off, and I grab a new piece of tape, and I put it on there. And I make sure to do my little sanding technique. Now for the bending of the handle. I'm going to decide where I'm going to bend it at, and on that point on the top, I'm actually going to cut a little V groove into it, so this way it doesn't bunch up where it's going to bend. Keep in mind, once you do this, you cannot go back. Now, as Biggie pointed out, we're going to be using some real machine screws on this thing. I'm going to use these 2 small screws. They're both different sizes from each other. You can use whatever size you want. So yeah, just put them in the holes and put the nuts on. There you go. And that's actually the final assembly. But now it's on to my favorite part of any build. For this step, we need a few things. We need some water. I'm going to use a number 8 filbert brush and a number 2 filbert brush. We're also going to be using this Mars Black Heavy Body Liquitex, and we're also going to be using some burnt umber and raw umber. And then for rust, we're actually going to use raw sienna, and we're also going to need lots of paper towels. For the first step of weathering, we're actually going to pretty much dirty everything. So we actually want to have a good mixture of the Mars Black, the burnt umber, and the raw umber. And we're going to really water this down so it gets nice and thin. Now when you're mixing these, don't get too thorough with it. It's good to have the little variations in it. It'll make it more believable. So it's actually pretty simple. We're going to put some paint on the chainsaw. I like to work in little patches. So once that's down, we're going to let it sit for just a little tiny bit. And we're going to take some paper towels and we're just going to dab it off. So I repeat this process over and over until I get something that looks good. Now, what looks good is going to depend on one of 2 things, and that is how this is going to be used. If you want to put it up on a shelf and have people look at it in person, I would suggest maybe knocking back the weathering just a little bit, but if it's being used for camera, you actually want to overdo it, but not overdo it. So really it's about finding that balance. It's a good idea to take lots of pictures of it from different angles, different lighting and stuff like that, and just see what it looks like and then work from there. Now the next step is I'm going to put some rub and buff on this. I put some out on a paper towel and then put a little tiny bit on my finger, and then I wipe most of that off, and then I lightly go over certain edges. Now you want to try and focus on places where the paint might scratch off in real life on the chainsaw. Obviously sharp edges, corners, just you decide where you want to put it. Once you have the rub and buff, we're going to put some more weathering paint on top of it to dull it down a little bit. Now let's move on to the blade. For this, I use a damp sponge. I just dab some paint onto it. Any excess I kind of remove on a paper towel and just start dabbing away. You sneak up on it. You don't want to put too much down at once. You want to slowly build up that dirt and grime. Using a hairdryer can actually speed up this process a whole lot. Once that's dry, you can flip it over and do the other side. Now it's time for the rust. Like I said, we're going to be using raw sienna for this. So what I do is I take my number 2 filbert brush and I kind of put a little paint underneath any overhangs and stuff like that. Then I take a clean brush and I actually pull the paint downwards to simulate the water dripping that would happen in real life. Another technique that I developed that I use rather than just pulling the paint down with a clean brush is you dab some paint onto it. Try to use a cheap brush because I kind of destroyed this thing by doing this. And you just kind of like smash at it a bunch and kind of spread the paint around. I found this gave us a nice rusty look. Now I'm going to add some rust in some random places with another sponge. Now again, I use this sparingly. Okay, so that's pretty much the weathering paints. Now we got one thing we got to worry about. I have these shiny new bolts. They're going to be used to attach the blade to the chainsaw, and they got to be turned into old looking bolts. The solution is actually really simple. I'm actually going to use this stuff called Perma-Blue Liquid Gun Blue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour some into a little cup, and I'm just going to drop the bolts and nuts in there. Now make sure you're wearing gloves for this because this is icky stuff. The problem I'm running into here, those little bright shiny spots, those are air bubbles attached to the actual bolts. Anywhere those spots are, they aren't going to get the bluing. So you want to make sure to remove all of them. I used the end of a paintbrush to get this done. After just a few seconds, depending on what kind of bolts you use. I believe the ones I used were zinc, so it worked extremely fast, but you just pull them out, you wipe them down with a paper towel, boom, you've got old bolts. Now there's still one detail we got to make here, and that's the grip that's going to go inside of the chainsaw so that we can actually hold on to something to keep this thing on our arm. For that, I just grabbed my floor mat foam and I pretty much just cut something out that's going to fit in my hand. I used my Dremel to shape it up to get it nice and comfortable, put little grooves in it to where my fingers can fit. And then I took a scrap piece from when I was cutting it down to size. I'm going to use that as a spacer. So I'm just going to glue those two pieces together. And then after that, I'm going to shape it up a little bit more. So now we got to attach it to the actual chainsaw. Unfortunately, I can't show you what's happening here, but basically I'm just taking the brush from my barge and sticking in the chainsaw and just kind of wiggling it around, hoping I get some in the right spot. And I go to install the thing and it doesn't hold. Somehow I managed to get absolutely no glue on the side of the chainsaw. Where it went, I don't know. So I just go for it again. This time I try to make sure they get it on the side, and then I stick my hand in there. Make sure you have gloves on for this. And I just kind of mushed it around and spread it around the wall to make sure that it's covering the area that I need. It worked. Good job. Once that's set, give it a good little test. Now all that's left to do is attach the blade. And with that,